World leaders are meeting in New York to mark 80 years since the United Nations was established after the end of World War II. The gathering comes at a time of rising global tensions. The wars in Gaza and Ukraine and recent Russian violations of NATO airspace are likely to dominate the agenda. The former German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who is now the president of the United Nations General Assembly, says the world stands at a crossroads during a time of darkness. While the UN's founding values remain intact, its Director General admits the international body is struggling to achieve its objectives.
In the aftermath of the Second World War, delegates from 50 nations, representing 90% of the world's population, assembled in San Francisco to make a commitment to the world.
Now my duty, my honour and my privilege in the chair to call for a vote on the approval of the Charter of the United Nations, including the Statute of the International Court and also of the Agreement on Interim Arrangements.
The outcome was the founding of the United Nations and a treaty enshrining equal rights for all and a pledge to maintain global peace. Today, the main UN body has an annual budget of over $3.6 billion, with contributions assessed on a country's size and capacity to pay. However, the cost of the myriad of UN agencies is much larger and principally funded through voluntary donations by governments of member states. These include the World Food Programme costing $9.7 billion, UNHCR, the Agency for Refugees, at $10.7 billion, and the World Health Organization, $6.8 billion. While the United States still contributes to the core organization, shortly after his second inauguration, President Donald Trump signed a slew of executive orders, slashing America's financial contributions to multiple agencies and pulling out of others, like the World Health Organization, altogether. The theme of this year's UN General Assembly is Better Together. But the nations who sit in this chamber have rarely appeared further apart.
As we have no carrots and no sticks in a world in which we have the geopolitical divides that we have, it's extremely difficult to make the protagonists of the present conflicts understand the need to come to peace.
The Security Council is currently struggling to pass any motions on Ukraine and Gaza, two of the most pressing issues of the day.
Let's unpack this with DW correspondent Janelle Dumalaon. She's at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Janelle, so the UN has been around for 80 years, but is it going to survive the next 10?
Nicole, such things, of course, are really hard to predict, but of course you have a very good reason for asking. The UN does really seem to be facing an existential crisis right now. It has been seen as largely ineffective in terms of solving the world's problems. It has been unable to bring conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and the like to an end. At the same time, it is losing, as we saw in the report there, its most important political and financial backer in the United States, as the U.S. under Donald Trump appears to be losing interest in collective action. It is also facing a budget cut of $500 million and a staff reduction of 20% because of reduced financing from the U.S. And there is a fear, of course, that autocratic nations will step in to fill that void left by the United States, and that in turn would give the UN a problem of how to balance the need for more financing with the need to have its UN Charter upheld. So this is really a problem, and it is, of course, facing a very painful reform right now, which means that it will have to prioritize. Some things will be left by the wayside. Some things will be given more of a focus. We don't really know which falls in which category. But what we are seeing, Nicole, we don't know how the UN will look like in 10 years, but because there are these very real problems and challenges that are inevitably going to change it, it's not going to look like it does now.
What are the main challenges for the organization right now?
Well, Well, it's a well-known fact that there is currently a very high level of paralysis at the UN Security Council as member states use their veto power to block resolutions that they don't like. We've seen Russia repeatedly block resolutions that are related to Ukraine. We've seen the US block resolutions that are critical of Israel. At the same time, at this very current iteration of the UN General Assembly, there are also these divides over Palestinian statehood. We have seen the UK, Australia, and Canada recognize the Palestinian state, while countries like the US and Israel, they remain opposed. This is obviously going to be the object of a conference here later on. And at the same time, this is the UN. We're talking about 193 countries. There's still this global north and global south divide as the developing countries of the world try to get the richer countries of the world interested and invested in their problems, whether it's poverty, whether it's climate, whether it's hunger. So the theme of this General Assembly may be better together, but of course there are very, very real divisions, as we can see here.
What are you going to be watching for in the debates and meetings planned for this week?
Well, it may be officially only kicking off tomorrow, but there's already a lot going on today. I mentioned that conference later on a Palestinian statehood sponsored by France. France also expected to recognize Palestine later today. There is also this ongoing UN Security Council emergency meeting on the Russian incursion into Estonian airspace. Now, looking forward to tomorrow, we are also, of course, eagerly awaiting the speech of U.S. President Donald Trump. He's expected to tout U.S. contributions to the UN, even at a time where, again, the U.S. is losing interest in it. There's also going to be another UN Security Council meeting tomorrow on the war in the Middle East, the situation in Gaza. And for the rest of the week, there's going to be a climate summit on Wednesday and the first AI conference of its kind on Thursday, where tech CEOs will be brought together with government. So definitely a very action-packed week here at the UNGA, with quite literally the weight of the world on it.
That's Janelle Dumalaon. Thanks so much for that. Let's bring in Richard Gowan. He's the UN Director at the International Crisis Group, which is a global conflict prevention organization. Richard, thanks for joining us today. I'd like to start with a brief assessment to set the scene. The UN at 80, where does it stand?
Well, it's not a very happy birthday for the UN, because over the last few years we have seen geopolitical tensions undermining cooperation in the Security Council on issues including Ukraine and Gaza. And then simultaneously, the UN now faces a massive budget crisis because the Trump administration simply isn't paying its dues to the organization. And that means that the Secretary General is having to propose some pretty severe cuts, both to UN staffing, but also what the UN actually does out on the ground, helping vulnerable people.
The motto of this year's General Assembly is better together, but it seems like especially the UN's most powerful members, the US, Russia, have given up on multilateralism. What does that mean for the UN's ability to fulfill its mission?
Well, the fact that the US is blocking all action over Gaza, or Russia blocks all action over Ukraine, does mean that the UN is pretty marginal to some of the biggest crises of the moment. I think it's worth saying that there are still a lot of smaller countries and middle powers that want the UN to succeed. And actually, even though the US has been boycotting a lot of UN meetings this year, we have seen other countries agreeing a new treaty on being better prepared for future pandemics. We've seen the ratification of a treaty on the protection of the oceans. So it is possible for the UN system to keep functioning, even when you have the US outside the room. But when it comes to peace and security, which is top of everyone's mind this week, then frankly, you do need the big powers on board, and the big powers are not being very helpful.
Yeah, DW got the chance to speak to the new head of the UN General Assembly, Annalena Baerbock. She said that for every country in the world, the UN was, and I'm quoting her here, a life insurance. What meaning do these words have for people tormented by conflicts around the world, in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, for example?
Well, in the field, on the ground, the UN is providing food and shelter and other services to over 100 million people worldwide. The UN offers assistance to the equivalent of the population of Mexico every single year. That's a huge effort. And the tragedy is that some of the US budget cuts that we have seen this year have hit the humanitarian agencies especially hard. The humanitarian organizations like the World Food Programme were very dependent on American funding, and now they are facing a budget crunch. And that does mean that the UN will be feeding fewer people, vaccinating fewer people, sheltering fewer people in the years ahead, and that is a human tragedy.
The Guterres reform proposal that you mentioned, the UN 80 proposal, would also include significant cuts for the humanitarian sector. Do you think what he's putting on the table would be enough to get the UN into a shape where it can actually fulfill its mission, where it would be up to face all the challenges that could come towards a multilateral organization the scale of the United Nations in the 21st century?
So Guterres is racing to keep up with events, and his UN 80 reform proposal, in the first instance, is really a cost-cutting exercise. I mean, he is trying to shrink the UN Secretariat by about 20% of its staff members. That's deeply unpopular with UN staff, but it's probably a financial necessity. Guterres is also trying to lay out some bigger picture ideas about how the UN could reform. And it is obvious, if you look at the UN system, that it contains inefficiencies, it contains entities with duplicating mandates. There are 3 different agencies in Rome that deal with food issues, for example. So I think that there may be a pathway to downsizing the UN system in a way that is responsible and actually makes it more efficient. But Guterres doesn't have very long to do that. He's only got 15 months left in office. And it is, I think, probable that it will fall to the next Secretary General to make some of the really hard choices that are necessary about major institutional reforms that Guterres can propose, but he doesn't have time to implement.
Let's talk about Security Council reform, because that is something that the international community has been discussing for decades to no avail. It's deadlocked over the biggest conflicts of our time. It doesn't represent global reality. So what would meaningful reform have to look like so that the UN can do what it was created to do, maintain international peace and security?
Well, I think in the short term, we're actually very unlikely to see progress on Security Council reform. The Biden administration, after Russia used its veto over Ukraine, did actually hold a series of consultations on what Security Council reform could look like. Just a year ago, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Biden's ambassador at the UN, announced that the US wanted to see African countries getting 2 permanent seats on the council. But the Trump administration has taken a very different line. US diplomats are telling their foreign counterparts that President Trump likes the status quo, in which the US is one of just 5 veto powers. And there's definitely a sense that discussions of council reform are fizzling here in New York. You'll still hear a lot of leaders talking about it, and especially a lot of leaders, I think, are going to say that it's crucial that limits are put on the use of the veto. But I'm afraid that I don't see a political pathway to that for the foreseeable future.
All right, so we're looking at a UN that is underfunded, overstretched, and under attack. Will it be around for another 80 years?
Look, the UN has been through some very difficult periods before, and it's certainly been through some really major financial crises. And I actually started working in New York, studying the UN just after the Iraq War in 2003. And that was another period when everyone thought the institution was in an existential crisis and no one was sure how the US was going to treat the UN in future. So we have been here before. This is a particularly bad set of circumstances, but the UN has proved resilient in the past. I think we do have to accept that the UN is going to shrink. We do have to accept that the UN is not going to go back to the immediate post-Cold War moment when it was able to expand a lot in an era of international cooperation. But I actually do think that a smaller UN can still provide some essential services to the international system and to vulnerable people if we get reforms right in the years ahead.
Richard Gowan of the International Crisis Group, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
And we can now talk to Dr. Yolanda Kemp, Spies. She's a former diplomat and director of the Diplomatic Studies program at Oxford University in the UK. She joins us from there. Now, some say that after 80 years, the UN has outlived itself. Do you agree, or do you think the world still needs the UN?
I don't agree. If we didn't have the United Nations, we would have to invent the United Nations. What has changed dramatically is the circumstances under which this organization was founded. But let's be honest, the organization itself has also transformed over 80 years. It's good to reflect now that it becomes an octogenarian, being 80 years old, on how it should evolve. But I still think the organization transcends the sum of its parts. The moment it is less than that, we can call it obsolete.
Now, the UN is often criticized for being slow, expensive and ineffective. And you already hinted at that, but can it be reformed, especially considering that reform would mean veto holders giving up some of their considerable influence?
You are now referring specifically to the United Nations Security Council. And I agree that that is the least likely to be structurally reformed of all the organs and all the agencies of the United Nations. But the United Nations is much, much bigger than the UN Security Council. And I would argue that much of the work of the UN Security Council is already outsourced to regional organizations. And I would even recommend that much more of it should be channeled towards the United Nations General Assembly. And there is precedent for that. In 1950, the UNGA adopted the Uniting for Peace resolution, which means that when the permanent members are unable or unwilling to pay attention to a pressing issue, the General Assembly can take matters into its own hands. And at the moment, we see two of the permanent members, United States, acting unilaterally, globally, Russia having invaded its neighbor, the United States even going as far as renaming the Pentagon the Department of War, which is reminiscent of 1930s pre-UN behavior. So I don't see us waiting for them to take leadership or willingly give up any of their veto power. So we need to move beyond relying on the Security Council to solve peace and security issues.
A bit of a redemocratization, if you will. Now, money is always an issue and is always a big issue, and the UN is under pressure from funding cuts, especially with the US reducing support. Could this become an existential crisis for the organization? Who could step in?
Yes, it is an existential crisis, and it means that the UN needs to reconsider the way it operates in its entirety, not just the way it is funded. From my perspective, the future for the UN lies in cooperative associative arrangements with other international organizations, and especially with non-state actors, coalitions of the willing, if you want to put it that way, to focus on specific areas that the UN decides should be prioritized. But just like any other entity in the world, nobody can do everything for everybody. And it does mean that there should be a prioritization of urgencies in the United Nations. And all of this takes a collective deliberation of strategic priorities. But just as we can't rely on the US to anchor the world in peace and security, or many of the other permanent members, we can't continue to rely on them to fund this organization.
Now, given your experience as a diplomat, in a nutshell, what gives you hope for the UN's future?
Human nature, human resilience, the fact that the UN was once founded in the ashes of the collapse of what was then assumed to be the center of civilization, Europe, and just ingenuity of actions. Our memories are short. At the moment, Mahmoud Abbas and 80 or plus of his staff members are not allowed to travel to New York to attend the United Nations General Assembly. But in 1988, that same General Assembly moved temporarily to Geneva because, ironically, Arafat back then was not allowed to attend, again, not allowed by the US. And I don't see why we can't move the General Assembly temporarily to a neutral country. Switzerland is a neutral country. It would make much more sense.
The director of the Diplomatic Studies Program at Oxford University, Yolanda Kemp, Spies, thank you.